So, you always hate to hear your introductions, like you write it and you send it and you are like, ooh. But every time I hear that I've been doing social justice work for over 30 years, it's a little daunting. And I probably would date it back, because my mom would tell you I did probably my first sort of movement activism work. There was a police action shooting in Tampa, and I remember dragging my mom to like community meetings around community organizing, and I probably was third or fourth grade, and I was the youngest person in the room, but I was sort of always interested in sort of championing for justice. And so near and dear to my, she nods, near and dear to my heart, her dropping me off and being like, oh my gosh, I have to sit through yet another meeting. So I want to thank the YMCA for the invitation and for this opportunity. There is a lot of hard work and a lot of generosity goes to make these efforts work. So I am deeply appreciative of the experience. And lots of people who don't know me, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I am a hoarder of knowledge, so I consume a lot of things. And so when I got the invitation to do this, I went back. I think I've binged on Y Speaker Series, so I can attest there is a YouTube channel, and I put it on while cleaning, and I watch, at least 3 to 4 hours a day. Because I wanted to get a sense of style and form and those kinds of things. I had popped into some, but I wanted to sort of get a lay of the land about all of my different options. And I was really inspired by some people who really turned it into like this very conversational style and a dialogue. And I want to be that person, but I am not that person. So rather than sort of try out a new tool, I'm gonna stay to what feels most comfortable for me. But I also am open to you, although we said questions will come at the end, I am very open to you raising your hand and making comments. So I can be very fluid that way. Last thing that I want to say, I over-prepare my PowerPoint slides. So I have 28 slides. I probably will not talk about all 28 slides. So if I skip something that was super important to you, that you were like, that was the one thing that I needed, let me know and I can make sure you have my PowerPoint, because I'm not attached to it. But I don't want to be welded to the PowerPoint, because that sort of interrupts the way that my brain works. And so let's get going. When I was asked to come up with a topic for this, I will tell you, as somebody who's in a lot of spaces where I'm talking about community violence, so I'm going to say this up front. So one of the things that Casey said was, hey, Karen's going to talk about some of the work that she does in the community, and I am going to talk about a little bit of the community violence work that I do, but this is more of like aspirational, not what is currently in place. So I want to have an honest conversation, because this is more of like, this is what the gold standard would look like, and let's then co-create around trying to how to get there. And so what I wanted to say to a lot of the folks that I work with, both here and in other communities, so this is not just a message about Champaign County, I do have the privilege of doing some work other places, is I have a lot of conversations about community violence, even with my Uber driver yesterday, and people frequently want to have a dialogue that simplifies the conversation. And what I'm hoping we can do in this space is to broaden the dialogue and maybe to have a different conversation. So I did a little bit of research. So when the title is not unique. I've heard it before. It is even the lyrics in a Taylor Swift song, which I was not aware of. But I did find that this was the definition I was thinking. So the Urban Dictionary says that to use Band-Aids to treat bullet wounds means to apply limited resources to resolve massive problems and I had to clean up the language, to try to fix an extremely large problem, usually caused by some idiot like your boss, that you're expected to pull some fairy dust out of your butt to fix. So butt was the word that I edited, because I did not want to put the other one, even though I realized that salty language is appropriate in this venue. But from my perspective, and I don't know if for those of you who read or pay attention, when we're trying to address community violence, sometimes people are like, hey, here's $50 to resolve gun violence. Or let's make up a bumper sticker and then everyone will put the guns down, right? And so it feels like the latter, like some boss is saying, hey, let's resolve some massive social problem with $50. And so as fate would have it, I was in Indianapolis doing some trauma training that I'll talk about a little bit, and I heard a news story. So downtown Indianapolis, every single weekend I am in Indianapolis doing trauma training recently. Every single weekend there's been a shooting downtown Indianapolis, and I was like, okay, universe, like, what is this about? But this was a news story that I heard, so I'm gonna multitask for a second and go straight to it. You're gonna
Indianapolis this year involving teenagers. The latest case Friday night on Monument Circle involving a 16-year-old. Working for you, RTV6's Graham Hunter asked city leaders how they're responding to the teen violence, and he's also finding out how people who spend time downtown are feeling.
It starts with the parents. You have to know a 16-year-old should not be out there.
Tasha Page has worked downtown for over a decade.
You got to know what your children are doing at night.
She was just getting off work in September when 6 people, including 3 juveniles, were shot on Maryland Street. It wasn't the first time. In May, police suspect a 16-year-old of shooting 4 people, including 3 teenagers, downtown, also on Maryland.
I feel like Indianapolis has always been a downtown safe environment, and now it's just getting a little bit out of control.
It's popular now to have a gun on your hip.
Heaven Wright is 18. She has seen it firsthand.
We're losing so many people. It's stuff happening every day, downtown, west side, any side, you know.
In August, Wright's life was touched by gun violence.
My sister's name is Shanita Caffey. She was 25.
Caffey was in a friend's car.
She was over on Lafayette and Tibbs at a Marathon gas station, and they were actually at a stoplight.
A dispute over money.
They shot him 5 times.
26-year-old Miles Cross died in the shooting. The killers turned to Caffey.
In the midst of her getting shot, all you could hear her say is, I have a daughter, I have a daughter, I have a, and by the mid-sentence they shot her.
2 men were arrested for the murders.
We fought for justice and they have them, but you shot an innocent person, and it hurt us really, really bad, because even with you locking him up, that won't bring my sister back. She was beautiful, she was fun, outgoing, and everything. Anything I say is probably an understatement for who she really was, because she was just that amazing.
Now Wright has some ideas of her own to end the cycle of violence.
Kids need to get involved with mentors, with groups, and just positive stuff.
A spokeswoman for the city says they're working to create programs to get kids off the street, including Youth Resource Fair event next month to connect kids to job training programs.
Honestly, it's like if a kid's not in sports, or if they're not playing basketball, football, cheerleading, or track, whatever it is, then they're out in the streets because they don't have anything else to occupy their time.
Working for you in downtown Indianapolis, Graham Hunter, RTV6.
Graham, thank you. If you have any safety concerns and you aren't getting answers, connect with us. Email us at workingforyou@RT.
So I found that video. First of all, it's absolutely heartbreaking to think about, you know, Heaven's story and how trauma impacts her family. But it is a very familiar story, right? In terms of, oops, I promised. In terms of how violence gets articulated. And so typically, right, in almost every news story, when people ask, hey, why is there youth violence or why is there community violence, one of the first solutions is, right, I put them up here, it is the parents' fault, right? So, right, how you color a story tells you what you think is the problem. So, and sure enough, they started the story off with, parents are not supervising their kids, right? We hear that all the time. The other thing that they included, because again, this is a talking point, what kids need are mentors. That is why kids are engaging in community violence, is there are not enough mentors. And the third talking point that it covered was that people need jobs. Right? That is the reframe that if you pick up the newspaper, you will hear those three stories over and over again. For longer conversations, they might add the following. We need more police. We need harsher sentences. And then we need more gun control, and then the last one that I heard last night, that I've actually heard from a number of people in the faith community, it is a spiritual issue. There is nothing we can do about it except for get on the corner and pray a lot. All right? And I am not negating the legitimacy of all of these things, but I will say that they are very simplified answers to really complex problems. So I want to say, let's take a minute, and we can only have a minute because I want to be careful of the time, but I want you to, let's walk through one example. So hypothetically, let's go with the theory that kids are engaging in community violence. First of all, I want to say most gun violence is not conducted by young people. It's conducted by adults, but we never want to have that conversation because that is a presumption that I guess the adults are throwaways, and we're only concerned about the young people because those are the only ones that are salvageable, right? So that says something about what we believe about community violence. But let's go with the mentoring hypothesis. So I want you to just take a second and ask yourself, if kids need mentors, why would that be? What would be the need that you would say a mentor is designed to address? Okay, all right. That's right. And is that a symptom of a larger problem or issue? Is the fact that kids don't have this, what we believe to be caring, consistent adults in their lives, a symptom of something else? And then, what are the policies, procedures, and practices that exist that contribute to that symptom? And so the comment was, most programs that are designed to work with youth don't acknowledge their families, nor do they occur in the communities in which they serve. And we don't do that because we believe the families don't know what they're doing and aren't legitimate and wouldn't be helpful. Which are right, and so to think about the policies, procedures, and practices that exist, that you would have that as a worldview. Does that make sense? There are structures that happen through either implicit bias or through assumptions about parenting or all of these other things that feed into what we do and how we design programs and solutions and services. And so I'd like us to continue to chew on each one of those things as, why does that exist? Why would we see that people need more police? Why would we see people need, when we come up with these solutions, where does that come from? And what does it say about our assumptions about the communities in which we're serving and also our ability to offer solutions? So for me, it always leads to sort of a big sigh, and I saw this, because I find myself being in places and spaces where I'm saying to people, I'm a what about it person, right? And people who know me will say, I'm always going, And then what else? Okay, And even in the best situations where we're going to design the most amazing mentoring program, we know that dosage and intensity matters, right? Because if I'm a young person who is having lots of complicated needs, you spending an hour with me in a lunchroom or 45 minutes with a lunchroom is not going to be the caring, consistent adult that I'm going to need in my life that we sort of fantasize them to be. And I want to add a few more sort of data variables to what I want to say. So, and I'm going to have to read these because I want you to also consider, and these are from the Violence Policy Center when they did a research paper on the relationship between community violence and trauma. And so, also consider, what if the chronic activation of the body's stress response system has been shown to disrupt the efficiency of brain circuitry that leads to both immediate and long-term problems in learning, behavior, and both physical and mental health. Think about that mentoring solution. Also, what if there is evidence that says when an individual lives in constant fear of their own safety and those around them, such as the result of fear that you have from living in community violence, the body responds by incorporating fearfulness into a more generalized outlook where every situation holds the potential to bring about harm. The shortcut is, if I'm in a neighborhood where I feel like there's a threat of violence, it would be normal for me to be more on guard to protect myself from the fear of violence. And until you remove the fear of violence, I'm going to do what I need to do to protect myself from threats of violence. Last one I want to remind you of. So repeated traumas can lead to anger, despair, and even psychic numbing, resulting in major changes in the personality and behavior. Some studies have found that as many as 1 in 6 children in neighborhoods impacted by community violence meet the criteria for complex PTSD. 1 in 6. So, what is that like for you to think about the 1 in 6?
Doesn't evidence also show now that there's a potential through epigenetics that then that gets passed on to the next generation?
Absolutely. And it could take up to 3 generations. So the comment was that there's research that says that through epigenetics, that's in the genes, that maybe some of those trauma responses, those PTS responses could be passed down. And what we believe, based on emerging science, is that it could take up to 3 generations for it to leave your gene pool. If you're removed from the toxic stress. Yeah, if you're removed from the stressor. So think about what that means in terms of how we're responding. And from my perspective, I'm actually working with a mom around this right now who meets criteria for complex PTSD, and it has been very, very difficult for me to find providers who can help one adult mom, let alone, I mean, we currently have how many shootings? I think over 126 shootings to date, it may be higher. Each one of those shooting victims, people have probably 4 to 5 people in their surround that are also impacted by community violence, of which none of those folks have a lot of options to get the right response. Right? Okay. So I'm going to shift gears, and I'm actually going to, I promise you, I end up going ahead. So what do we know? We know that community violence gets fed into, so we know that trauma is correlated with community violence. And there is an initiative called Building Resilient Communities that has an ACEs tree that talks about the importance of looking at adverse community environments as a contributing factor to ACEs. And even deeper, there are people who do something that's called racing ACEs. So ACEs, I just want to say, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is a big longitudinal study looking at childhood trauma. And a lot of times ACEs are the big kinds of traumas that people tend to think about. Child abuse, having maternal depression, neglect, all of those. When people think about trauma, most of the time people are thinking about adverse childhood experiences. The definition of trauma that I like and use also includes little t traumas, things like poverty and oppression and microaggressions and food insecurity. I call those little t traumas because those are traumas that impact people on a day-to-day basis. Those aren't one-time acute events. Those are traumas that dysregulate your mind, body, and spirit and cause toxic stress on a regular. And so if you think about this ACEs tree, it makes room for consideration of both the big T traumas, but also the little t traumas. And building resilient communities say the only way that we can go about addressing sort of the root causes of trauma and community violence is to think about changing adverse community environments. So how do we do that? This is just my little commercial. What I'd like for you to think about, and I've read this quote and I couldn't find it, is if you were going to see community violence as a symptom of a community's health or wellness, your responses would be that you would have to work on community healing to address community violence. And we would also need to restore harm that has been done to communities and acknowledge the harm that we've done to them. Because what I find from doing this work is a lot of the institutions in community that serve or exist to serve communities that are impacted by adversity have been associated with harm. And rarely have there been restorative practices to say, hey, we screwed up, and the reason why we're coming back to you to say come here is that we acknowledged our screwed upness and we want to do it differently. But instead, we have policies, procedures, and practices where we have caused harm. I'm going to pick on, not that they're bad, but I'm going to pick on school systems, for example, because schools have had have been accused, even in Champaign, have been accused of engaging in structural violence for people. That's why we had a consent decree. There's been no public acknowledgement that we have caused harm to families impacted by adverse community experiences, right? No conversation like, we didn't do right by you, and we want you to keep sending your kids here, but we promise to do something differently with you and promising not to re-traumatize you. That would be an entirely different conversation. But instead, we expect people to trust us when we haven't had a relationship or earned their trust. Other things I want to remind you of. For me, having an anti-oppression lens is foundational. Like, we can't do this without tackling oppression. And when I'm talking about tackling oppression, I'm saying we gotta make commitments to dealing with structural inequalities. And we have to make some commitments to seeing each other's humanness. Anytime something happens in another neighborhood and I don't see those as being my children, my neighbors, connected to me, we re-injure each other and we get disconnected, and it makes it hard to be in a resilient and healthy community. So anytime we other. And then the last thing I want to mention on this slide is anytime we have power over and we develop programs, services, good ideas, research, or whatever, where we do things to people and not with them, we will inevitably hurt them. And so in my fantasy world, no funding decision, no program, no service would exist without the locus of power, control, and decision-making being within the communities most impacted by that decision. So imagine if every grant, if you don't have people in that, if it's designed to serve a neighborhood, if people in that neighborhood aren't a part of what you're doing, if they're not a part of the decision-making, they haven't told you they want it or need it, you can't do it. That's about changing the status quo and really, really changing the power structure. So notice I'm not talking about simple answers to complex problems. I'm really asking us to envision another way. So there are two more things that I want to say. So how do we get here? So I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to open it up to, I'm going to talk about it in examples, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So we get there by acknowledging the impact of trauma. So we really need to be thinking, one of the things that we ask people from a trauma-informed lens is to start wondering, like, what's happened to people, not what's wrong with people. And I had the unfortunate privilege, it was a good experience. I went and got my hair done yesterday, but my hairdresser had the ID channel on, and if anybody's ever watched the ID channel, they always have like psychiatrists and psychologists on to talk about people. And story after story after story, they talk about, anytime somebody commits a crime, they always say, oh my gosh, they're a sociopath, they were unfeeling, they were uncaring. I am so tired of that narrative. Because what we've learned, even, and we've learned this from even with working with child soldiers, even people who do what we would consider the most atrocious things, statistically, most of those people, there's a small sliver of people who would just, right, like we would say no, but the majority of people, so let's aim at the majority of people, have the capacity to be empathetic and caring and feeling when we give them empathy and caring and healing, and we create the opportunities for them to de-roll in safe, supporting, and nurturing environments. Notice, we create the opportunities through being safe, supported, consistent, and nurturing. I also want us to acknowledge historical trauma, because I don't feel like we have enough conversations. I love getting invited into spaces to talk about trauma, and this happened to me recently. And they asked me to talk about trauma and parenting, and so I went to talk about racism, and I had like people really like disintegrated. And I was shocked, because I thought, like, I've talked to you guys a lot about trauma. How did you not think that I was going to talk about racism? And literally people freaked out. And so I was like, oh, I need to say this out loud. We can't talk about trauma without talking about racism and sexism and homophobia and heterosexism. We got to address it all. Let's also make a commitment to, like, imagine if we all left out here and said, we want to see things that address toxic stress as a priority. You guys probably have a list of things that cause toxic stress, everything from buildings that look dilapidated, to not having grass, to being in stressful, super busy environments, to having food insecurity, to not having access, right? Like, there's a list of things that cause toxic stress. Let's all make a commitment that everything that we want to do for the next year is around reducing stress in people's lives. That means that when we're in the grocery store, imagine how we respond to people in the store. When we're on the roads, how would we respond to each other? And when we're thinking about policies, procedures, and practices, if it is not designed to reduce stress in people's lives, so if it is something that makes a mom take 4 buses to get to, we would say that that is not a good program, services, or support. I don't care how well-intentioned your food pantry is, if the hours are from 12 to 2 and most people can't get to it, we would say, let's make a commitment to reducing toxic stress. right? Let's also remember that all healing happens in the context of relationships. Every single encounter you have with people, because we have to assume that people are hurting. So statistically, in this room, about 20–30% of you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So if I assume that at any given moment, there are trauma survivors in our midst, and that I have a gift to offer them, I would be different with them. And communities that are doing some of this work are realizing that we have to, one of the things that won't solve trauma, particularly broad little t trauma, is expanding the therapeutic network. Therapists are great, but the way that we heal from trauma is through relationships. Because even if I have the best therapist in the world, if I walk out and the front desk person is grumpy and mean to me, if I have to take a bus and my bus driver is mean to me, if my neighbors don't speak to me, doesn't matter how great that 45 minutes of therapy is, it gets all undone by my lived experience. And also remember, in the context of all healing happens in the context of relationships, kids' relationships with their parents also matter. So let's stop designing programs, services, and supports for children that don't consider their families. There's a saying that says nothing about us without us within systems of care and wraparound. And what that means is that no decision gets made for families and children and communities without families, communities, and individuals. And then the last principle about how we get there is let's commit to avoid re-traumatizing people. So one of this last one was a foundational principle about what it meant to be trauma-informed, was an awareness that trauma frequently happens in healing systems, and that frequently we re-traumatize people when we're trying to be good to them. And if we made a commitment, so the ways that we re-traumatize people is we have policies like if you miss 3 appointments, you get quit, we fire you. Or we say, and I will tell you, I experienced this, we will say, hey, we're an organization or a school and we're working on being trauma-informed, but we will fire you we will discipline you harshly. We will suspend or expel you without having a conversation with you and your family or the community. So we re-traumatize you because on one end we said, hey, we're going to be there for you. On the other hand, we say, oh, except for when you mess up and then we hurt you. And there is no way back in. So let's do that. There are some examples of communities that have done really, really great things. I just want to mention a couple things. So some communities are doing things like having self-healing circles. Other communities, people use the word wraparound a lot. People don't know it actually grew out of a village concept. It's an indigenous concept. It's when children and families had social and emotional issues, people used to grab the village, and wrap around a family and say, hey, what are we going to do? And we would be, and that village would be with that family to address the social and emotional issues. And providers only got brought in because they had tools and resources as supports. They didn't own the plan. The family owned the plan. And the powerful thing about that is long after your funding is gone, if it is my village plan, we continue to support the family, right? Because we're with them. And we also have all the tools. Other communities have done things like changing the built environment, because we don't talk enough about parks and place and environmental spaces. The other thing that I also remembered is frequently neighborhoods that are impacted by a lot of adversities get contaminated with a lot of environmental toxins that also create toxic stress and structural changes to brain, body, to make recovery and healing difficult. So let's commit to changing the built environment. Some communities are, and this is my other wish, some communities are moving to make sure that people have access to food. And so they're moving from neighborhood food banks to actually having bodegas, where they're actually grocery stores that people can go to in buildings within communities, where they have access to healthy food all the time. Because frequently in neighborhoods impacted by adversity, we have corner stores with candy and liquor. There's a whole lot of spaces in our communities for healthy food and gardens and access to the things that we need to heal. Hiring, I've actually seen some communities, okay, I'm gonna stop. Some communities have also really been effective at hiring neighborhoods to do anything that happens in a neighborhood. So if it's like the city people who are in charge of cleanup, they don't hire people who don't exist in that neighborhood to do city cleanup. So every single job that exists in a neighborhood, imagine if the locus power could, if those were people hired in the neighborhood. And the last thing that I'm going to say, because I want to open it up to questions, is imagine the power of building skills within the neighborhoods. Because a lot of times we'll say, okay, come to the table as full decision makers, but we haven't built capacity, we've offered no training, offered no leadership development, offered no support. And then when people sit at the table and they're tokenized, we go, well, we invited you to the table, but didn't equip you to fully be participating in the system. So again, in my fantasy world, there would be leadership development that would be meaningful and purposeful so that communities could fully join us. So I have clearly over-prepared, so I'm gonna stop, because I wanted to allow you a chance to provide some feedback and to know that we're trying to do some of this work. We're trying to do some of this work by influencing through the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative, by influencing policy procedures and practices, by training sort of neighborhood champions to work people by people to help support individuals who've been impacted by community violence. We're using the wraparound model because in our fantasy world, one day, no one would ever have to come to a provider for wraparound. Neighbors could actually be like, hey, we need to come together and talk about our children's mental health, or grandma's retirement, or our sign. We could do this with each other with our own tools. So we're trying. So join us. So I want to open it up for questions. Okay. Yes.
I'll defer to anyone else, but I was just wanted to comment on how unusual that news clip was, because it went to 2 African American women. And it's much more likely if it had been broader, like the dominant community, it would have been gun control and or more police enforcement. So I just wanted to comment on that. Last week's speaker was also suspicious of mentorship. And I'm wondering if you could develop that a little further. Is it inauthenticity of the relationship or the power that's involved? Or I'm not quite sure if it could be implemented well in some circumstance or whether it's just intrinsically a problem.
So I'm going to try to summarize that. So the things to offer. So he said, hey, he noticed what was unique about the video clip was it had 2 African Americans, and I will tell you, Indianapolis has a really interesting racial history. So you should always check that out. So there's a reason, there's a method to the madness. But then there was also a comment that last week's speaker also was suspicious of mentorships. I think the reason why a lot of us are suspicious of mentoring as a program or service is that everybody sees that as the panacea for every single social ill. And from the research around mentorship, it is good for about 30% of the population. Frequently, 20 to 30% of the population, particularly as it's designed as a program or service, it's good for kids who were going to be okay anyway, as it's designed as a program or service. However, mentorship as what would be authentic would be real relationships with people who are connected to you for the long haul, who are also connected to you and your family. And what young people tell me, particularly young people who are juvenile justice involved, is like when they need somebody like at midnight when they're getting ready to make an unwise decision. What they also need, dosage intensity matters. What they also need is like a whole bunch of good stuff, not just once a week or twice a week. So what it would take in terms of dosage effect, like literally if I'm feeling uncared for, if I'm having signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, I need a long-term relationship with somebody who can be there with me in the middle of the night, and I probably need to see them 4 to 5 hours a week at a minimum in my community, and they need to have a relationship with my family for the long haul. Most people who come to me with a binder to say, because a lot of people come up to me and tell me, I want to create a mentor program. What do you think? And I always am like, the last thing, and they always want to do that for kids who are juvenile justice involved. And I'm like, can we try something else? Can we do something different? Can we, because the commitments that the young people need, you're not willing to make. And until you're willing to get in there and really get in there, you become, again, let's stop re-traumatizing people. Because so many people come up with a mentoring program and what they want to do it is for a year or two, and they disappear. They don't want to be there at night. As soon as somebody disappoints them means get back into trouble or do, right, what we know about change. Then they're like, oh, I want a new one. They have no relationship to the family. So let's do something different. And also think about what works for you. We all, like any of us who are here, probably had some caring, consistent adult that was there for us that probably did not have the title mentor, but served as a mentor for us. What if we could offer just that? That's a protective factor. All right, okay. I think he wants it. Okay.
Oh, okay. Peace, everybody. I had a question. Well, I had a couple of things. One, as someone, I personally see trauma-informed as inherently racist. Yeah, so I was wondering if you can perhaps dissect this idea of using ACEs, which is a very like white supremacist metric, and how do you negotiate that? And in addition to that, do you consider healing sacred? And if you do, who should be providing healing?
Okay. Wow, okay. So you and I are going to have this longer conversation around trauma-informed care as being inherently racist, because for me, so this is just me, the reason why I like trauma-informed, having done this work for a long time, is it takes all of the things that people told me were good around being culturally responsive, around addressing systematic oppression, and it gives me the why for that. So people who would dismiss the conversation to be like, oh, I should be culturally responsive because it's a good idea. If I told you that if you don't see me with all of who I am, you and I can't have a relationship and I can't be safe with you. And so if I think about what it means to be trauma-informed in terms of the principles and practices, you can't do that without having a commitment to social justice and attacking racism. And so everybody who's really sort of deep into the work will tell you, I will agree that people have used ACEs as sort of like this catch-all, and ACEs is this big of the trauma story. So I 100% agree with you that I feel like it's reductionist to just talk about ACEs. ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and again, it's just those top 10 traumas, and for those of us who've had the top 10, there's no way you got the top 10 and not had about 20 or 30 more. Because we kept living. And ACEs doesn't talk about how many times you experience those traumas, and the only thing I will say about this, and I want to go back to your last question, and I'm almost done, is that I know for myself when trauma-informed care was first introduced to me, it's probably why I decided I wanted to talk about it. I would go to conferences and events, and they would always bring out a woman who looked like me. She was always a woman of color, always a woman of color. And then she would tell some horrific story about losing her children and being involved in child welfare and prostitution and jail, and it was always a woman of color. And so I was like, oh my gosh, what in the world is this about? And so I started talking to some of the people who were doing the work, and like, why is that the only story? Because, right, it feeds into a whole bunch of implicit biases. And so, and I remember, because I actually had an interview with the National Council for Behavioral Health to be a trauma consultant with them, and when I told them what my ACEs score was, and I was like, I have an ACEs score of 9, and I said, I've never been in a mental hospital, never been hospitalized, blah, 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 and I had a whole bunch of more traumas beyond that. She was like, you've never been to a psych hospital? Never? And she was like, well, how did that be? How is that? And I said, well, one of the ways is because the stuff I'm talking about, I got. So I believe, I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I do believe that resiliency in relationships trumps ACEs. And I had the privilege of having relationships in a community of people who really looked out for me. We don't tell that story. And so I think that it's how we tell the story that gets in the way of people's understanding. And so, linked to that, your last question was, if all healing happens in the context of relationships, right? If we're about healing, who should be in charge of the healing? And I do believe that the healing, so this is all subjective, right? I still believe that the locus of power, control, and decision-making has to happen within the communities in which are most impacted by the experiences. So I think that there's some power where we heal in relationships. I didn't talk about this, but there are people who are doing things like restorative justice hubs. And there's a power in doing a restorative justice hub because when there's community violence, there's a rupture in that relationship. So as a community, we're the only people who can tell you how to make it right. And you're going to come back to us. And how is it that we stay in relation, or you're somebody's child or somebody's daddy? That's a community rupture that we need to deal with as a community. So that's why I believe the healing needs to happen in community, but I think the capacity for healing can happen in a lot of different ways, but it would be wonderful if we put more of that within communities most affected, because most people got to go someplace. The other thing is, I poo-poo, I'm a therapist, but I don't believe all healing needs to happen in the context of therapy. It is a part of the story. It is a tool that people can use. It is not the story. And so we need to be serious to have people have wellness plans multi-layered, because that's the thing that builds resiliency. And that's the commitment to change, right? Right, so I could be depressed all day long. I could take some pills, and I can also have some social connection. If you don't make sure I have the social connection, no amount of just pills is going to heal. Okay.
Okay, Karen, you mentioned the restorative justice hub idea, and I'm really curious to know a little bit more about what that would look like as a hub, this notion of a hub. Can you flesh that out a bit for us?
I can try, probably not successfully. So I will say, I do know in Chicago they're doing something like, they're doing this where they partner with the courts and actually it becomes an alternative. So they handle issues of community violence. They have a panel of people from that neighborhood who are trained, and they bring in other neighbors to discuss that. Locally, I know, because I just talked to Marlon and James about this, First Followers is working on trying to create something like that, so they want to begin having conversations around what that would look like, especially in a community like Champaign. Every time I look at a police shooting, and unfortunately I've been doing work in Champaign for about 16 to 17 years, I did a youth program, and I went through recently a roster of young people who came through my youth program or a program that I work with called the Access Initiative, and 1 in 4 folks who've been involved in shootings, victims, have been in one of the programs that I work with. That means that they connected to, so if there were 37 kids who came in for a summer program, if one of them died, that one person, those 36 other people were impacted by that young person's life. And that those families are all here, and their families are all here, and we got to do better about healing all of these broken hearts. So, thank you all so much. Thank you.